Thanks for coming along tonight, folks, to hear Malcolm Mackerras making a welcome first appearance at the Sydney Institute. I'll introduce him briefly. He's an economist and a political commentator, best known for his commentary on Australian and New Zealand elections and the Mackerras Pendulum. And there's a copy of this here tonight, hot off the press, a link to an article in the Daily Telegraph here on the 28th of March. Down the bottom it tells me, please turn over Malcolm Mackerras, which is a bit ambiguous, but I did. And there's more on the back. And we also have a pendulum for Victoria. Now, Malcolm promised to bring along a real pendulum, but there was some concern that they wouldn't let him on the bus with one, so we've just got to do with the paper version. So here tonight is Malcolm Mackerras to talk upon the Mackerras pendulum and me. Malcolm, you're very welcome.
Well, thanks, Gerard, for inviting me, which I must admit came as a great surprise to me. I didn't think at the age of 85 people would take me seriously anymore, particularly when, as I always say, the Mackerras pendulum is the original and the best. And I didn't think anyone would want to hear me say that, but I'm afraid that's what I think, so I might as well keep on saying it. But anyway, look, what I've done is prepare an academic type of paper which comes to 11 pages. But I haven't been able to print off enough. I've got about 10 there. If anybody really wants to read the paper, there are plenty of copies, and I have plenty of copies of the current pendulum. Anyway, look, I'll start with the paper. I'll sort of talk to the paper, shall we say. Now, the person who seems most to promote me actually is Murray Goot, who wrote a very good article, an excellent article in 2016 in the Australian Journal of Politics and History, very scholarly article, in which he goes through basically all the people who've contributed to this idea, but he says basically I'm the person who popularised this concept of the two-party preferred vote. So I'll begin by saying, Murray Goot having promoted me, I don't know that I need to promote myself too much, but I've been asked to give a bit of a history of this. So my history begins essentially in March 1951. In March 1951, there was a double dissolution of Parliament implemented by William McKell on the advice of Robert Menzies, and there was a general election for the entire Parliament in April 1951, and that is when my interest began. I followed that election extremely closely, and I've followed every election extremely closely ever since. And I think I'm correct to say that the forthcoming election is the 49th. I'm pretty sure it's the 49th general election. So I count my numbers of elections as 19 before I was born or before I became interested, 1901 to 1949, and 30 from 1951 onwards. Now, when I first became interested, Australia's leading psephologist was a woman by the name of Joan Ryden. She first became prominent in September 1940 when there was a general election, and I would say she's the first case of a leading psephologist. I would say at the age of 30, I superseded her, and at the age of 50, Anthony Green has superseded me. So I date my position as Australia's leading psephologist from 1970 to 2010, and I regret to say that from 2010 to the present day, I have to admit that I'm irritated by Anthony Green. But I don't deny that I call him Australia's leading psephologist because he is. And that's that. Now, when I started this game, Australia was really a two-party system. It really was. Virtually every seat was a contest between the Labor candidate and the Liberal candidate, or the Labor candidate and the Country Party candidate. Virtually every contest. So that in 1949 there was a huge redistribution of seats, massive redistribution of seats, but nobody thought of the idea of doing something like that. But nevertheless, on a private basis, on a sort of distribution to people only interested, there was an exercise done like that of about 3 pages, all of which were stated in the majorities. We used to talk about majorities in those days. For example, Harry Turner would win Bradfield with a majority of 20,000. John Cramer would win Bennelong with a majority of only 8,000. Billy Jack would win North Sydney with a majority of only 5,000. Bert Everett would win Barton with a majority of only 300. It was always majorities. Now, I started to realise that this wasn't a very good idea. One of the things that made me realise this was that I became interested in British elections at pretty much the same time as I became interested in Australian elections. And I did think it was rather idiotic, as I have noted here in this paper. Clement Attlee became Prime Minister in 1945, and his majority was 6,700. He then lost a couple of elections later, but his majority locally was twice that, except that's ridiculous. He got a very high percentage in the first case, 84%, and only 67% in the second case. So obviously percentages were the way to go, not majorities. I mean, it's ridiculous to talk about majorities in this kind of circumstance. So then I thought, well, really, that's not good enough. We really have to have a pendulum. In other words, I've developed the two-party preferred vote concept, which is the obvious concept. It just became completely obvious. You can't assume that the 1961 election has any similarity with the 1949 election. It simply doesn't. So I realised basically after the 1961 election that really you have to have a two-party preferred vote from now on. And then I realised following the 1969 election that really you had to have a pendulum. Anyway, for what it's worth, there was a massive redistribution in 1948, effective from 1949. There was another massive redistribution in 1968, and I produced that book, which was the first of its kind. But at that stage, I hadn't realised that the two-party preferred vote was the way to go. So I would say the Mackerras pendulum is 55 years old. Really, no, it really is, because I really started developing it in March 1970. It was first produced for the 1972 election, and ever since there has been a Mackerras pendulum. Every single election from 1972 to the present day, there has been a Mackerras pendulum printed in newspapers without any exception. It's become part of the scenery of elections. So the next question I raise is this: does it work? Well, it does have its critics. So I'll tell you what its critics say. Its critics say two things. Firstly, it assumes a uniform swing, and since swings are not uniform, since election results produce different results in different seats almost randomly, the whole idea of a uniform swing is not sensible. That's the first thing they say. The second thing they say is, this was all very well in 1972 when there was a two-party system. It's ridiculous now because we don't have a two-party system. Well, my answer to that is simply to say that this pendulum, of which there is a copy, has two sides. In 1972, in fact in 1974 and 75, 77, 80, there was no need for that. But I now have to write an essay which is titled Fitting 9 Parties into a Two-Party System, because there are 9 political parties. With seats in the House of Representatives, there are 9. But I still insist that it is essentially a two-party system. So the pendulum that gets published in the paper, which is this, is the two-party pendulum. On the left-hand side are the Labor seats. They also include the Green seats. I insist that the 4 green seats should be shown as though they are Labor seats. It also includes 2 seats held by independents on the ground that the 2 seats held by independents are Labor seats. And the 2 seats are Clark in Tasmania, held by Andrew Wilkie, and Fowler in southwest Sydney, held by Di Lee. These are Labor seats. So those seats there are all ranked according to the swing needed by the Liberal Party, or in some cases the Nationals, to take a seat from Labor, except in the cases of Wilkie and Di Lee, it's the swing needed to take the seat from a notional Labor winner. So in other words, the swing shown for Di Lee is actually the percentage swing needed by the Liberal Party to take the seat from Christina Keneally. And the same in principle for the other one. But in other words, on this side of the pendulum, you have all the seats that are naturally Liberal, National, or held by an independent in a natural Liberal National seat. The interesting thing about that is that the category Other has 2 on the Labor side, 9 on the Liberal National side. But the interesting thing is, when I did the pendulum following the last election, there were actually 10 such seats, one of which has been abolished. The seat is North Sydney. There are now 9, so these independents, 2 sit in natural Labor seats, Clark and Fowler, that's Andrew Wilkie and Di Lee. The other 9 sit in natural Liberal National seats. But it so happens that of the 9, well, of the 2 that live in natural Labor seats, one is a man of the left, without the slightest doubt. The man of the left is Andrew Wilkie. He will definitely support a Labor government. The other one is Di Lee, who used to be a member of the Liberal Party, and who will support whichever government it is. She really is an independent. I've no idea what she'll support, but I can tell you pretty much with these other 9 over here, what I can tell you is that one of them, Bob Catter, refused to support the Gerard government. The other 8 consists of 6 Teal independents plus 3 others. Now the 3 others are Rebecca Sharkey, who's likely to support a Liberal government but not necessarily so. Helen Haynes, who I think is actually of the left of politics. No, what I can tell you is 6 Teals and 3 others, so Catter, Haynes and Sharkey. Now, a Liberal government could only hope really to get 2 of those. So what you actually have is 9 natural Liberal National seats, blue ribbon Liberal National ones, promise no, of which only 2 members would be likely to support a Liberal government. All of which has caused me to say, and write, throughout the whole of the period of the last Parliament, that look, Albanese will win this election. I've really never been in any doubt about it, because the Liberal Party's defeat was much heavier than the 2-party preferred vote seemed to suggest, because its heaviness is not merely that Labor wins all these seats, but in the fact that these blue ribbon Liberal seats are held by Teals, or held by Rebecca Sharkey, or held by Helen Haynes. So for that reason, I've really never been in any doubt about who would win this election. But I'll tell you my precise prediction before the end of my talk. But what I'll do before I give you my precise prediction is to tell you that this argument that you base your pendulum upon a uniform swing is what they say as critics. I say that's not true. It is based upon cancellation of deviations. That's actually what it is. Now, the best example I can think of a cancellation of deviations, the best example I can give of cancellation of deviations actually is a very, very recent election. In March 2025, there was a Western Australian election. The Labor Party had won 69.7% of the 2-party preferred vote at the previous election, the genuine landslide won by Mark McGowan. There was a 10.8% swing against Labor in the 2-party preferred vote. So that the most recent election, the figure is 58.9 for Labor and 41.1 for Liberal National. Now, if the swing had been perfectly uniform, the Liberal Nationals would have won Churchlands, Warren Blackwood, Nedlands, Careen, Bateman, Geraldton, Scarborough and South Perth. They won 6 of those and they didn't win 3. The 3 they didn't win were the upper middle class suburbs of Perth. The Liberal Party failed to win the blue ribbon Liberal seat of Bateman, which is on the south side, by the way. It failed to win the blue ribbon Liberal seat of Scarborough. It failed to win the blue ribbon Liberal seat of South Perth, all of which were won by Labor. But 3 other seats that were safer went to Liberal National. The result was that the number predicted by the Pendulum's uniform swing model turned out to be precisely correct. Now, I could go through all of these. I've done this for lots and lots of elections, shown the deviations, and I find that regularly the pendulum works. That is, the cancellation of deviations works. So it doesn't matter if I name seats wrongly. The point is to get the number correct. That's the point. So cancellation of deviations is the critical element in the Mackerras pendulum, and I insist on that. But I do admit to 2 federal elections that are exceptional cases. There are 2 cases. The first was 1987. Now, in 1987, something very peculiar happened. The Hawke government increased its majority in the House of Representatives. It increased its majority from 16 to 24. Yet the overall swing was 1% towards the Liberal National Coalition. Now, that's not meant to happen. So that's the first exceptional case. My explanation for it is put out in some detail in this paper if anyone wants to read it. But basically, this is what I'm saying. It chanced to be the case that there was a huge swing against Labor in the Newcastle, Sydney, Wollongong conurbation and in the Melbourne metropolitan area. But there were only 2 marginal Labor seats. Labor lost those 2 seats on this massive swing. Now, at the other end of the country, you had a stack of marginal seats held by Liberal and National, which Labor picked up. So that on a rather smaller swing, they picked up all these seats in Queensland, Western Australia, South Australia and so forth. So that explains that. Now, the other case is John Howard's victory in 1998. Now, that is a peculiar case because, look, I think really what happened there was people instinctively knew that Howard was campaigning for good policy. So in all the seats that mattered, the Liberals pretty well won all the seats that mattered. There were huge swings to Labor in the Labor-held seats and in some Liberal seats. But basically, it had the effect that a 51-49 division of the vote, 2-party preferred, in favour of Labor, produced a very workable majority of 22 seats for the Howard government. Now, look, those are the only 2 cases where the pendulum hasn't worked in that sense. In the other 20 cases, basically you've had cancellation of deviations, which means I think I can predict the result of elections. So how do I predict the result of elections? Really, it's quite simple. I make a guess of the 2-party preferred vote. No, it's as simple as that. You just make a guess of the 2-party preferred vote. If your guess is badly wrong, as in 2019, then you'll make the wrong prediction. But apart from that case, you'll make the correct prediction because you can translate into seats the overall 2-party preferred vote. So in the current election, well, essentially I've made 2 predictions, and after the event I will claim either that was the correct prediction or alternatively I'll claim that is the correct prediction. That being made 1 month later. So I'll tell you what this article says. It opens with this statement. At Christmas, Anthony Albanese will still be Prime Minister. He might lead a majority Labor government, but I think a minority one more likely. I then say the result will be 71 for Labor, 65 Liberal National, 40 on the crossbench. Now, that's Labor with 5 seats more than Liberal National. Now, you're not going to tell me that Dutton will be the Prime Minister in the event of that happening. What you can say is, if you are very, very hostile to the Greens, you'd say that is the worst conceivable result, the worst possible result, because the Greens will then be able to exert a considerable amount of power. So that's one prediction. Right, now, 1 month later, tonight, I have made a slightly different prediction. And I put it out in this paper, so I'll tell you what it is, and I'll tell you that I've been saying this to anybody who asks me, which is quite a lot of people. Firstly, I quote that remark. And I begin by saying, at Christmas, Anthony Albanese will still be Prime Minister. But these are now my numbers. I'm saying Labor 76, Liberal 45, National 16, 2 Greens and 11 Independents. Now that is a majority Labor government. Now, I'm aware that, of course, what I'm really saying is it might be 78 or it might be 77 or it might be 76 or it might be 75 or it might be 74. That's really what I'm saying. But all I can tell you is just take the news poll, public most recently, apply it to the pendulum and put in your own knowledge of some of these individual circumstances and you get that result. And I've found when I've said this to people, virtually nobody has suggested that this, well, pretty much everybody agrees. Now that I think about it, this is like the likely result. So which prediction will I claim after the event? Well, if it's a strong Labor, a very strong Labor win, like 76 seats or 75 or 77, I'll say, well, I made the correct prediction on the night of the 23rd of April. If it is a slightly weaker win, but with Labor clearly a bigger party than combination of Liberal National, well then I'll say, well, that's what I wrote in this article. But the point is there's not a great deal of difference between the two. Well, except this. If you are fanatically hostile to the Greens, you would say that those two results are very different, wouldn't you? Because a lot of people, when I say these things, during the period when I was saying this thing, almost everybody I said this to, said, you are predicting the worst possible result. That is the worst possible result you could possibly get, because the Greens will then be able to extract all sorts of things out of a Labor government. And now I would say, well, I've changed to this. And the very same people who then said, that's a very bad result, and now say, look, that'd be quite a good result. It'd be much better to have a Labor strong win so that they don't have to give in to the Greens. So anyway, that's my prediction. Anyway, how am I going for time?
You've got about 5 minutes.
All right. Okay, well, I've got a section here, my future and that of my pendulum. Well, I begin by saying, when I die, my pendulum will go out of existence. No, it will, obviously, because I'm the only person who gets public pendulums published in newspapers. There are other rival pendulums, but they're not really pendulums at all. They are listings of seats. The best known example is the Tower of Power you see in the Australian newspaper. Well, I think it's a ridiculous diagram myself, but anyway, you get listings of seats by other analysts, like the Tower of Power and like Anthony Green's so-called pendulum, Ben Rowe's so-called pendulum, and so forth. But look, when I die, the pendulum will go out of existence altogether. So what's going to happen to me? Well, the way I describe it is to say, having been given the letters AO to my name, I think I have been properly rewarded in my lifetime. I really do. For that reason, I deliberately do not aspire to have a street named after me in Canberra. And I state here why that is the case. But I can say that my main interest these days is electoral reform. And I happen to think that there is a very, very distinguished electoral reformer who wasn't properly recognised. When I was invited to give the eulogy at his funeral, attended by 15 people, I said, well, look, I'm going to make sure that there's a street named after him. And if you go to Canberra, to the suburb of Denman Prospect, you will see there are streets named after people, and the theme is activism and reform. If you go to this part of Canberra, you'll see there's a Lex Watson circuit. Bogey Mushadlek, the description of Bogey Mushadlek is here. In my opinion, Bogey Mushadlek gave the ACT the Hare Clark system. I helped him, but look, Bogey Mushadlek did that, and I think that was a very significant fact, because my opinion is that these proportional representation systems we have, which we have 7, consist of 2 proper single transferable vote systems. There are 2. The Hare Clark system in Tasmania and the Hare Clark system in the ACT. Then there are 5 what I call corrupted single transferable vote systems. What I mean by that is the single transferable vote system is a candidate-based system. When you put in above the line, which these other 5 have, you corrupt it because you change it from being candidate-based to being party-based. Anyway, I thought Bogey Mushadlek should have a street, and the street is now being constructed. Now, I also noticed that my uncle has a street named after him in Canberra, and that's very appropriate for the same kind of reason. So I finish up by saying, as I said to you earlier on, Anthony Green irritates me. The first irritation that he causes in me is he and I seem to take the opposite side of every electoral reform argument. I won't go into any of that anymore, but the other thing, the one that really irritates me, is the way he has generated the word margin, to which I object strongly. These statistics are the percentage swing required to lose. Now, he then calls them margin, but doesn't put on the additional part discipline. So if you look at my pendulum, and if you looked at this pendulum and compared them with Anthony Green's listening seats, you'll see that in half the cases, the numbers are precisely the same. In the other half, mine is 0.1 higher. For example, in Hawke, I say the swing needed by the Liberal Party to take the seat of Hawke is 7.7. He says the margin is 7.6. Well, I say international practice favours my view. Nobody else would say that the margin is other than the difference between the biggest and the second biggest. Everybody else in the world would say, well, the margin is, you take the biggest number and then the second biggest, and the margin is the difference between the 2. So the way I would describe this forthcoming election is to take the example of Bradfield. We all know that the 2-party preferred between Liberal and Teal is 52.5. Now, Anthony Green says the margin is 2.5. I say the swing needed by the Teal is 2.5, but the margin is 5. The difference between 52.5 and 47.5 is 5. Now, everywhere else in the world, including the Americans and the British and everybody else, would say, well, the margin is 5. But he says, no, the margin is 2.5, which brings me to another little hobby horse I have, which relates to that pendulum I showed you here. Here's my little irritation. Take this pendulum here. Now, I show Labor 54, combination of Liberal National 5. I say majority is 49. 49 is the difference between 54 and 5. But most modern writers, if you read the papers, would say, no, the majority is half that. They would say it's 25. Well, that irritates me hugely. So I'll finish with my irritations. And if you're at all interested in getting the paper, you can read about the details of my uncle, why he has a street named after him. You can read about Bogamushlak, why he used to have a street named after him. And you can read any other details, including the details of my predictions. So, there we go.
Many thanks, Malcolm Mackerras. Now, we're coming to questions and discussion. Malcolm's paper, the one he'll be either right or wrong about, is distinct from this one, the other which you'll be right or wrong about.
The two don't differ a great deal, really.
Will be published in the Sydney papers as well, so if you don't pick one up tonight, Anne will be publishing the full paper there, and it will last forever. Meanwhile, we're taking up a bit of a campaign. We've learnt a lot about deviations tonight, which I didn't quite expect. So I think when you're no longer with us, and I'm no longer with us, I would like to think that from this night we got together and in Canberra, if there's any roadworks, we would have a Mackerras deviation. I think that'd work. We're going to campaign on that.
I think you should
Okay.
call it the Malcolm Mackerras
Oh,
deviation.
sorry. Okay,
So is it not to be confused with the...
all the others, yeah.
Yeah,
We
well,
know
you
about
call
them,
it-
yeah.
Call it the Malcolm Mackerras deviation. if you
Okay,
like.
we're on to it. Okay, now let's go back to questions and discussion. I'll put these away and shuffle them so become a bit confusing. Tell us about the start of the Pendulum again, because when you started that, say 55 years ago, what did the academics think of it? What did Joan Ryden, who became Professor of Politics at La Trobe University, for example, although she came out of Sydney originally, I think through the ANU down to La Trobe, what did she think of it? I mean, what kind of reception did you get from academics? Because you were not an academic at the time.
No.
No, were you? So
No,
tell
I
us a bit
wasn't, no.
about that, okay?
Yeah.
Come back here and talk to the end of the room.
Well, what Gerard says is perfectly correct. I was distinctly disparaged by people, and I think envy was the explanation for that. I think Joan Ryden disliked intensely that she saw that this young man of 30 was replacing her as the top expert. So that's my explanation of that. But I should make this point about Joan Ryden. I think there should be a street in an outer Melbourne suburb called Ryden Street, because I noticed that whereas Anthony Green has AO and I have AO with different citations, there's no record of her existence, and I think her existence should be recorded by a street in Melbourne. But look, otherwise I wouldn't say I love her much. But now that she's deceased, she has ceased to irritate me. Yeah.
What a wonderful talk about the outcome of the forthcoming election. And I spent a little bit of time at the racetrack when I was a very young journalist, and it was called an each-way bet. So, well done. But my question relates to your international comments. And there is a current president of the United States who I'm told, because I didn't actually read it myself, that he believed that Australia wasn't a real democracy because they had this chance of a second vote that would be counted. So it wasn't first past the post. You really had to do something that diminished Australia's standard as a democracy. So what do you think about Mr. Trump's alternative, and throw into that the first past the post that we're familiar reading about in Britain?
Well, look, as far as the British system is concerned, I will admit that I'm something of a heretic. I shouldn't admire it, I shouldn't support it, I shouldn't say it's a wonderful system, but I'm afraid I do. No, I do. It is unfair between parties, that's perfectly true, but it gives you a quick result, it gives you a decisive result, and it tends to be the case that extremist parties get punished by the system. The most recent election's example of that, the Greens were punished by it, and Nigel Farage's party were punished by it. And look, I have to say, in the case of the British system, if it ain't broke, don't fix it. I'm sorry I have to say that, because the system is not broke. But academics overwhelmingly say it's unfair between parties, it creates safe seats and all those sort of criticisms. Well, I agree with Winston Churchill. Now, Winston Churchill defended the system massively, so much so that in his memoirs he discusses the question of the House of Commons. Now, the House of Commons was bombed in 1940 by the Germans, and all the academics and people said you should design it differently, make it semicircular, have proportional representation, give a seat to every member and all that. And Churchill said, I won't have a bar of that. I want to keep this chamber so that it only fits in 2/3 of the members. That is the case. Only 2/3 of the members can fit into the House of Commons chamber. Why? Logic is a poor guide compared with custom, is what he wrote. In other words, we've had this system for a couple of hundred years. This is our customary system. These academics can go in for all the logic about semicircular parliaments with left and right gradations and all this proportional thing, all that sort of stuff. But he said, logic is poor guide compared with custom. Well, I say the same about us. We should keep our system. There are two systems that must be reformed. But apart from that, as far as I'm concerned, every lower house system we have in Australia should be preserved as it now is, every lower house system. Now, coming to the Americans, Donald Trump will eventually learn that the American people are going to prove him wrong, because at the moment there is a campaign for what they call ranked choice voting. Now, in the United States, everything is done on a state basis. So the case I quote is Maine, the state of Maine. Now, in the state of Maine, the electoral laws are, of course, determined by the legislature of Maine, as is the case for all 50 states. Now, what did they do? They had a plebiscite. The people voted for ranked choice voting. And the way it's sold is simply to say it's the right of the elector to transfer his or her vote from the losing candidate to a candidate still in the count. Now, you may be interested to know that in the case of the House of Representatives, there is a member of the House of Representatives, a Democrat, who won a congressional district that Trump carried, but who won on this transfer of votes from this third candidate who was excluded. Now, this will catch on. It will catch on because the Americans can see that there's a good argument for this. So in other words, the people are voting for it. And I think you'll find that's what happened. So far as Trump is concerned, all I can say about it is I have examined in great detail the 3 elections when he was the candidate, and I have pendulums for 2 of the 3. I haven't done the third one because I'm waiting for the absolute final 100% accurate statistics. But I can tell you this much. In 2016, Hillary Clinton won 2.8 million more votes than Trump. In 2020, Joe Biden won 7 million more votes than Trump. And in 2024, Trump won 77.3 million and Kamala Harris won 75 million. So the margin of the popular vote was lowest in the third case. Yet the media somehow have been able to persuade people, assisted by Trump and people like Rowan Dean in Australia and those sort of people, created the impression that the 2020 election was somehow stolen and this recent election was a landslide. Well, all I can tell you is add together 77.3 million to 75 million, take a percentage, Trump was voted for by 50.75% of the people, and Harris was voted for by 49.25%, is the way I describe his most recent election.
I first read your 1972 publication in the school library in 1973. It's great to see you in the flesh after 52 years.
Yeah.
What I wanted to say is that the Hare-Clark system basically gives a result that proportionally represents views in the community, and legislation goes through by compromise, except usually in the case of reducing government expenditure or increasing taxation or spending more on defence. Wouldn't a system which be better, which represented, where people had a better look at who they were actually going to be putting into the parliament, such that you had that runoff elections might be preferred even to the preferential system?
Well, we're left with the question of whether we should have a majoritarian principle or a proportional principle. Well, I'm quite happy for the British to keep the majoritarian principle, and I'm quite happy for the Australian House of Representatives to keep it. But apart from that, I accept the existence of the proportional representation systems we have. The reason why I put the Hare-Clark system with such high marks is that it is a genuine direct election. Members of the Legislative Assembly of the ACT and the House of Assembly of Tasmania are directly chosen by the people. Senators are not. The Constitution requires that senators shall be directly chosen by the people. But the machines of big political parties got into the system, corrupted it to such a degree that what we now have, when you are voting on Saturday week, I'll tell you what, you'll get a ballot paper, I'll tell you what it looks like. You'll get a ballot paper like this. Won't you? You'll get a ballot paper that looks like that. Now, the polling official will say to you, is your name Malcolm Mackerras? And I say yes. Are you correctly enrolled at 35 Creswell Street, Canberra? I say yes. Then she'll say, have you already voted in this election? I say no. In doing that, she has done what the legislation requires. He or she will then say further things not required by legislation. This is what they'll say. And to anyone who disputes me, please do so. He or she will say, for the House of Representatives, you need to number every square. For the Senate above the line, you need to number at least 6 squares. For the Senate below the line, you need to number at least 12 squares. What's my objection to that? My objection to that is that the House of Representatives statement is true. The Senate statements are lies. Both of them are lies. Straight out, unambiguously, they are lies. Why? Because it is required by law that a single first preference above the line shall be counted as a formal vote. That is required by law. Likewise, it is required by law that 6 preferences below the line shall be counted as a formal vote. It is therefore a lie to say you need to number at least 6 above the line. That's a lie. It's also a lie to say you need to number 12 below the line. Now, Anthony Green's defends this system, of course. I attack it, not surprisingly. So how does he describe it? Well, he describes it euphemistically, and I describe it correctly. No, I'm serious. I'm serious. He says, you are invited to number 6 squares above the line or 12 below the line. But it is counted as a formal vote that a single one above the line is counted as a formal vote. Now, that is a completely euphemistic description of it, completely. The Electoral Commission does everything it can to tell you that your vote's informal if you don't go 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, don't they? They do. They go out of their way to tell you that your vote's informal if you don't do that. In other words, it's not a case of suggesting. The correct word is instructing. So, at the risk of boring people too much, I'll tell you, well, if you don't mind, I'll tell you something interesting. I appear to be the only person who objects to this, which is a disgrace. I shouldn't be the only person who objects to it. But anyway, I wrote to the Electoral Commission in 2016 objecting to it, denouncing him in effect, and then again, and then again. And after 6 years, he decided to pay some attention to me. So the Electoral Commissioner, the then one, sent me a video, an educational video, which I must admit for 24 hours I approved of, but I'll tell you what it does. It is filmed in the old Senate chamber, right? And it features a middle-aged woman whose name is Kath, and this is what she says. She says, the Senate ballot paper is the biggest you'll get in the election. She shows you a small one, and then she says, some of these are quite big, and she shows you something like that. Then she says, you have a choice between above the line voting and below the line voting. If you vote above the line, you need to number at least 6 boxes. Then she says, you may hear that it's okay to number just 1 box. Technically, that is correct. We will count your vote even if you only express 1 preference for a party above the line. Then she says below the line, doesn't mention the 6 business, by the way. And then she says, we instruct voters to vote in accordance with the voting rules, not only because they are the rules, but because you get a better value for your vote if you vote in accordance with the voting rule. No, seriously, she said. And then she gives you 90 seconds of bullshit, basically. So, in other words, the way the video has been done, it admits for the only time this truth. It's the only occasion you won't get it admitted in. If you look at your little leaflet that you won't see that admitted. The only case of admitting is this one. But
Okay.
what do I think about this video? Well, as far as I'm concerned, it is propaganda in favour of the existing system.
So
What it is.
can we send out Ruth's video, can we?
Sorry?
Can we send out Ruth's video? Oh, Kath's video. Can we send it out? Anyone know?
Well, it's on the website.
It's on the website. Okay.
It's called Making the Most of Your Senate Vote.
Okay.
It's called Making the Most of Your Senate Vote.
Okay. Now we might
And
get...
I have described it roughly speaking. But the critical thing is, you may hear it, Technically that is correct. In other words, you, Malcolm Mackerras, are just engaging in miserable technicalities. No, but seriously. The Electoral Commission does everything it can to tell you that your vote's informal if you don't go 1 to 6.
Okay, we've got to move on. We may get Kath back here next time. So
Sorry?
we may get Kath back here after the election. Okay, so I've got one... Hang on just a minute.
It's true.
I'm losing control of this. I do have a Zoom question, which I think you can handle very quickly, and then we've got to get through the rest very quickly. But I've lost it. So Fred Chilton asked, and you maybe you don't want to answer this, but how could the Liberals, or how can the Liberals recover teal seats? Any ideas?
How could they recover teal seats? Well, I think wait long enough for a Labor government to make a mess of things, and then the teal seats will naturally return to the Liberal Party.
All right, so the question down here. Yep.
But that won't happen this time. But it could. It could well be that the second term of the Albanese government is a complete disaster. That is possible. Now, if that happened, the following election could be a landslide, and if there's a landslide against Labor, the Teals will lose their seats.
Okay, thanks for that. There's a question here.
Thanks so much, Malcolm. My name is Kath and I'm middle-aged. Nevertheless, I'd like to ask you about the state voting system.
Yeah.
So certainly in New South Wales, I'm not sure about the other states, you can not fill in all the squares, so it's quite
Correct.
different to the federal system.
Correct.
If you can comment on that and what you think about that. And the other one is that in Victoria, as opposed to New South Wales, as I understand it currently, in the upper house of Victoria, you elect in a group, where in New South Wales it's similar to the Senate, where you elect upper house people across the whole of the state. If you'd like to comment on those two systems as well.
No, we've got to be very brief.
Okay, well, on the New South Wales system, I have no reform in mind. Seriously, I have no reform in mind. Now, I know that the New South Wales Legislative Assembly system is different from the rest of the country. Well, as far as I'm concerned, the people of New South Wales decided on that it is entrenched. It can only be changed by a referendum. There is an argument for that. The argument is that you should be allowed to transfer your vote from a losing candidate to a candidate still in the count. And you should not be told that you lose your vote if you don't. For example, an example I have, a friend of mine in Canberra wants to vote for an independent and complains bitterly that she can't record the vote for an independent unless she is compelled to give her vote to the Greens or the Liberals or the Labor, and she doesn't want to do that. So there is an argument for doing that. That's the argument for doing that. The argument for the other is what I've just said.
Okay, we
Logic
better...
is a poor guide compared with custom. Now,
Yeah.
Victoria.
I've got to be brief, Malcolm. Yeah. You've got to be brief, okay?
Okay, the Victorian Legislative Council is the other system that needs to be reformed. The two reforms that are urgently needed are the Senate thing and the Legislative Council of Victoria. I don't have time to tell you every detail of what I'm proposing, but if you read the website of the Victorian Electoral Matters Committee, you can see exactly what I'm proposing.
You mentioned about the 1987 election. There was something similar in 1990 where there was a swing to Labor in Queensland and northern New South Wales, but in Victoria they lost 9 seats. The question I want to ask you is, in the context of your predictions, do you look at state polls as well as federal polls?
No, I don't. I make a guess of the overall distribution of the two-party preferred vote, and the pendulum worked perfectly in 1990. The deviations cancelled perfectly.
The deviation worked, yeah.
Right down the back, got to be very brief. Very brief. We're finishing in 4 minutes. Okay.
My question is more an observation on your comment about majoritarian versus preferential voting. I'm a New Zealander and went through the change from majoritarian to preferential voting, which has resulted in no party able to establish a majority under any circumstances.
What's that? Well, my comment on that is to say I don't approve of the New Zealand system, though mainly I don't approve of it because members are not directly chosen by the people, and they should be. By contrast, Anthony Green thinks it's a wonderful system. No, I'm serious. He thinks it's a wonderful system.
Thank you. Thank you very much. It was great to finish where we started with Anthony Green as an irritant. But for tonight, I just want to say thanks for coming along, Malcolm. Great speech, highly entertaining. One of our most entertaining nights, I think. If we can avoid a defamation risk. So we had a great performance tonight, and the paper, when it's printed by Anne in the Sydney papers online, is a sort of an academic discourse, and tonight we had something a bit different, a performance. So well done, Malcolm Mackerras, and all the best with the Canberra diversion.